People didn't wait. We just did things.
And that's what Anchorage is all about. You really just get out and live.
New stories have arrived every day for 100 years.
It was more civilized than I expected.
Drawn north by a powerful idea that something new can happen here. This is a story about Alaska's greatest city, Anchorage at 100.
A million years ago, they built a railroad and they lived in tents, and then they called it the Tent City.
100 years ago.
100 years ago. Anchorage is 1,000 years old, and it is called the Centennial.
100 years old.
100 years old, and it's called the Centennial.
Centennial.
It's called the Centennial.
This is the only remaining footage of life during the earliest years of what would become Alaska's greatest city. Played over and over, it offers few clues. Who were these people? Why had they come here?
Alaska in 1915 was overshadowed by the greatest catastrophe of the era, which is the First World War. Everything that takes place in Alaska and with the founding of Anchorage has to be seen in the context of the Great War.
The Great War brought desperate immigrants to Alaska.
Many of the workers who came were sometimes referred to in Alaskan terminology as Swedes. Now, a Swede didn't mean you were from Sweden. It was, one man wrote that a Swede was actually anyone who came to Alaska and had a strong accent. So many of these Swedes actually from Yugoslavia. There were many Croats and Serbians who actually came. Because of the troubled parts of Europe, Alaska was a great haven and an escape from the disaster of the war.
The war had convinced President Wilson the country needed a strong navy in the Pacific. That navy would need coal, and there was lots of coal in Alaska.
The justification for the railroad, in fact, was the coal in the Matanuska Valley or Chickaloon coal fields, having a secure supply of coal in the Pacific Ocean for the United States Navy.
In Seward, private entrepreneurs had tried to build a railroad, laying track all the way from Seward to Turnagain Arm. In Cordova, wealthy industrialists, J.P. Morgan and the Guggenheims, had built the Copper River Northwestern Railroad, 196 miles of private track to their Kennecott copper mine. They hoped their railroad would be the key to Alaska's next great chapter, but it didn't happen that way.
When President Wilson signed the bill in March 1914 authorizing the Alaska Railroad, there was jubilation throughout Alaska and the Pacific Northwest that finally, this long-awaited government railway would be constructed. The thing was, however, even though the railroad was approved, the decision yet to be made was where it would be built, and that was a different question.
In June of 1914, 84 men and their horses slogged through the mud at Ship Creek. They were one of 11 survey parties sent to help figure out where to build the railroad. There were already a handful of homesteaders in the area, But no one fully appreciated that what was about to happen would be one of the most audacious public building projects in United States history.
First of all, just the size of it. $35 million in 1914 was about 5% of total government spending that year. More importantly, it put the government in the railroad business. Never before and never since would the U.S. government be in this position of paying for, building, and then operating a major railway line like this.
Imagine the federal government in 2015 agreeing to spend more than $100 billion to build anything. Yet the mudflats at Ship Creek were chosen as the place to begin, and the stampede was on. In the spring of 1915, 2,000 people poured onto the mudflats at Ship Creek in just 3 months. 100 more were arriving every week.
Pretty amazing feat when you think about it. By that time, you'd already cleared the acres of forest down there. A tent city that had sprung up along the mudflats down in Ship Creek all of a sudden had to transition into a city up on the bluff.
100 years later, Anchorage Mayor Dan Sullivan says he can only imagine the immense challenges facing the city's first leaders.
The planning began immediately to carve out this new town. And obviously you need everything from the various merchants and professional services, doctors, engineers, but you also need the basic utilities that any city needs, including, of course, how do you deal with your sewage? And that was a challenge back then, and well, quite frankly, every mayor still deals with it.
Increasingly unsanitary conditions down on the mudflats would force a move away from Ship Creek within months. But in the summer of 1915, Tent City flourished. On streets named Broadway and Riverside and Main, merchants sold everything the new arrivals might need. There were bakeries and restaurants. Here's one of the few wells which supplied drinking water. Notice the downspout, tree bark. The quickly constructed post office was the most popular spot in town. It was the only connection with the families they had left back home. And the local government at the time was not local at all, but federal, and would remain that way for 5 years.
Not only do you have the government building the railroad, but also in charge of building and managing the town. The Alaska Engineering Commission was led by Colonel Frederick Mears, and he was in charge of making sure that this transition from a tent city to a real city happened quickly.
An engineer, Frederick Mears, ordered a new town site surveyed up on the bluff. 240 acres were cleared. And in July of 1915, everyone down in Tent City was invited to an auction.
2,000 people gathered to buy the lots that were being offered. What a fabulous opportunity that would have been for an auctioneer to make his name in history.
I got 30 bit to do, 40 bit to get a 30 bit to do. You're not bid now 110, but a bid now.
We asked Anchorage auctioneer Dwayne Hill to imagine that first auction and how he might sell 121 city blocks worth of tree stumps.
Lot 44, lot 1, opening bid, $400. Do I hear $400? 400, thank you, sir. Now 5.
And so the auction began. The rules for this auction had been signed a few weeks earlier by none other than President Woodrow Wilson. No lot would sell for less than $25. All buyers had to have 1/3 the money in cash.
8 1/4 there now, 8 1/2, 8 1/4 now, 8 1/2. 8 1/4 over here, 8 1/2. All in, all done.
The auction? A huge success.
Sold, 8 1/4. Sold.
650 lots sold for a total of $150,000. Another 500 lots would sell in less than a year.
Sold.
So all they had to do was buy a lot and build a city and then find a name for it.
They started using the name Anchorage as far as for postal purposes. Well, Governor J.F.A. Strong, the governor of the territory, said this is a terrible name. So they actually had a vote. And Anchorage came in third. Second was Lane, Alaska, after Secretary of Interior Franklin Lane, who was the guy who was responsible for the railroad. The winning name was Alaska City, Alaska, which shows the size of the dream that the people in Anchorage had for their community from the beginning. Alaska City would be to Alaska like New York City is to New York. But luckily they didn't, some of the other names like were Terminal Alaska, which might not have been a very optimistic sounding name.
So Anchorage it was, despite the vote of the people. But you know what? It's okay.
You sure?
I'm pretty sure.
It wasn't long after being named that Anchorage became home to two men who would shape the city for the next 100 years. One was a Russian immigrant.
Zachariah Lusak worked in New York's Waldorf Astoria Hotel. He came to Alaska in 1907, first to Nome where he tried gold mining, which was a total bust. Then he went to Iditarod, built a pharmacy, and it promptly burned to the ground.
The other was a ship's captain who was about to become Alaska's first homegrown millionaire.
Cap Lathrop came to Cook Inlet in 1896 as the skipper of a ship called the L.J. Perry. He built up what was a financial empire unparalleled in Alaskan history. He ran his enterprises with an iron fist and did much of the work himself.
Both Lathrop and Lusak set up shop on 4th Avenue. Lathrop built two movie theaters, first the Empress Theater and then the 4th Avenue Theater. Lusak opened two pharmacies. Inside, you could find almost anything. They were general stores, really, and very successful.
He was a great friend of my dad's.
Just a kid at the time, Ed Rasmussen remembers Lusak was not your average pioneer.
He loved to duck hunt, but he didn't like to shoot very much. And they'd go over to the duck flats, and he'd always take a book and a box of chocolate candies, so he could eat chocolate candies there and read a book and let the ducks fly by.
It was Lusak's love of books that began his legacy. The Russian immigrant endowed the city's first charitable foundation, the Lusak Foundation, which built the city's first library, an act in turn that inspired a local banker, Elmer Rasmussen, Ed's father.
My dad and Zach thought a lot alike, and they wanted to give back to the country that gave to them.
The Rasmussen Foundation, the state's largest private charitable foundation, is now worth hundreds of millions of dollars and funds dozens of programs across the state. Zachariah Lusak was a Russian Jew. Elmer Rasmussen, the son of Christian missionaries.
We feel very strongly that the Lord put us here for a reason, and it might sound trite, but I don't think it's trite. I feel that helping others is an Alaska tradition, and I'm sure Zach felt the same way.
Zach Lusak may have been the city's first philanthropist, but it was Cap Lathrop, the builder of the 4th Avenue Theater, who envisioned how Alaska would capture the world's imagination.
From the very start, Lathrop wasn't really satisfied with just showing movies. He wanted to make them. The Chechakos, Alaskan slang for all the newcomers flooding the north, was Lathrop's 1923 silent picture. He brought in top actors for the lead roles and then hired hundreds of extras.
All the extras all came from Anchorage. So when the film was screened for the first time in Anchorage, it really was like everybody in town went to their own home movie.
The film featured a steamship full of gold seekers, an engine room explosion, and a fight for the lifeboats. There was a chase across a glacier. And as you could have predicted, despite its huge budget, the Chechakos was a failure.
One of the problems with the Chechakos, as a reviewer said, was the title. Nobody outside Alaska knew what the title meant.
Another problem?
The story of the Chechakos is preposterously bad. Man kidnaps girl, man raises girl, then man marries girl. It's not necessarily no. I mean, it sounds worse than it is. Actually, it is worse than it sounds. That's what I mean.
Lathrop, however, had gotten one thing very right. He believed Alaska's mystique, its promise of adventure, would outlive any of the early pioneers. And look what happened.
A couple of times all the way down, looking all the way up. Good. Other side.
90 years later, Anchorage production company Hybrid Color Films is working on their latest. Winter Project, a documentary about extreme snow machining, is just one of dozens of film and reality TV shows focusing on Alaska. The film's director, Kyle Aramburo.
Alaska's always had that draw, and I think reality TV shows finally came up here and just saw it. So it's one of those rare places that you can still come, drive out of a main city, and kind of be out there. I mean, you're like out there.
Which, of course, was the same thing that Cap Lathrop was selling from the beginning.
He started it. You could argue the point that he started it.
Imagine Cap Lathrop walking into his darkened 4th Avenue theater to watch the trailer for Kyle's film.
You're riding this weekend. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. It was like we were going. We are always going.
I think he'd like it. We're telling a story, and so is he. So, I think he'd like it.
The bikinis?
The bikini, like that part, yeah. The scantily clothed women, yeah.
Lee Davis is a conductor for the Alaska Railroad. So's his brother Len. Brother Lane, sister-in-law Nancy, work for the railroad too.
We always get accused of talking about railroad too much at dinner.
And like the Davis family, the city has railroad in its DNA. The earliest images give a sense of not only the immense task confronting its builders in 1915, but their resolve and what had to be optimism.
To build nearly 500 miles of railroad across what was then seen by many people as virgin land was a giant investment that they hoped would pay off in the future.
8 years later, President Warren G. Harding was in Nenana on July 15th of 1923 to attempt to drive the Golden Spike commemorating the railroad's completion. Notice he misses, yet somehow the spike drives itself. No wonder they're applauding. Jump forward 1 decade to the 1930s.
It was a railroad town, and the railroad boss was the biggest man in town.
Dan Cuddy, who would one day run First National Bank Alaska, was an Anchorage teenager in 1933.
And the people that had the big jobs in the railroad had the big houses.
Well, we had chickens and cows and turkeys, and I don't think we had pigs, but dogs and cats. But we didn't have any neighbors, so we weren't bothering anyone.
Irma Lee Strutz, who would marry future Governor Wally Hickel, also remembers the simple railroad town of the 30s.
You knew everyone you felt. Every summer, the Elks Club, they would take all the kids to Lake Spenard. Then they'd treat us to a wonderful picnic out there.
Same lake, different purpose. This is the earliest known footage of a float plane operating in Anchorage. The pilot was a chemist, a civil engineer, and a World War I aviator. His name was Russ Merrill. In the 20s and early 30s, Merrill and other pilots took off from what is now the Park Strip. When Merrill disappeared on a flight to Bethel in 1932, a new Anchorage airfield, Merrill Field, was named in his honor. The town of 3,000 boasted 2 banks, the best drinking water in the world, and a 9-hole golf course, which was also on the Park Strip.
During the 1930s, there were 3 really major federal projects. The 3 big ones are the Anchorage City Hall, the new federal building on 4th Avenue, and Anchorage High School. Now, those really are pre-World War II monuments because they were built for a smaller town at a different time.
A monument of a different kind was also created in 1936.
We had hockey, boxing, basketball, and they had a full slate of teams coming in.
The winter sports tournament was called, are you ready? The Winter Sports Tournament. Over the years, the city's streets became racing trails for the fastest teams in the north, and the event was renamed Fur Rendezvous. Today, Fur Rendezvous is one of the nation's premier celebrations.
5, 4,
and features the Open World Championships.
Go! Go!
Kind of like the NASCAR of dog racing in Anchorage.
Now over 100 events, the 10-day Fur Rendezvous celebration is a party.
If you can think of Mardi Gras, everybody's dressed up in crazy outfits, and they're all excited to try to run with the reindeer.
The party that all began in that small railroad town back in the 1930s. The 40s, of course, would change everything. Fear of a growing Japanese military had spurred Congress to build Fort Richardson. In June 1940, the first soldiers arrived. The population of Anchorage doubled in just 16 months. The military buildup had begun.
The war brought Anchorage into much closer contact with the lower 48 in two ways.
Here is the motion picture record released by the United States Navy.
Number one was the construction of the Alaska Highway, because now you could drive all the way to Anchorage and Fairbanks. Number two was the development of air power and the growth of air routes, commercial air routes between Seattle and Chicago and Anchorage literally did a big part in making Alaska not feel so far away.
Before the war, Anchorage had just one paved road.
Anchorage was this little town where there were no numbers on the houses on the streets. There was no door-to-door mail delivery, and people usually left the keys in their cars because there was no way to drive out of Anchorage. There was no roads that went from Anchorage to anywhere. The war changed that. After the war, people no longer left their keys in their cars. They doggone well had to put numbers on the streets and on the houses. And the police started wearing uniforms.
Air transport is a principal industry. It's a new stop for the globe-trotter of tomorrow.
With the war now over, there was a new generation of South Central Alaskans, young veterans ready to begin a new life in Alaska.
Whose prices are almost double those prevailing.
Before World War II, southeastern Alaska was economically, politically, and demographically the center of Alaska. With the coming of World War II, the power balance shifted completely to the Anchorage-Fairbanks rail belt.
With that power came an increase in military and government spending, and new arrivals with every day.
Well, we came up in July of 1950 and rolled in on 4th Avenue, which was paved, the only paved street in town, and the rest of the town was just almost a cloud of dust.
Vic and Gloria Fisher drove up the Alaska-Canadian Highway.
We had worried about lack of civilization, so we bought a long-playing record player and 10 records that we couldn't live without. And we pulled in, parked in front of the federal building, and across the street was a record store. And I could have bought any record I ever wanted.
In 1940, Anchorage was about the same size as Fairbanks, with just under 4,000 residents. But in less than 10 years, its population had doubled a second time, and a third, to almost 32,000 people.
There was simply no housing available.
And a new idea gathered force.
Young people who were veterans who had served in the military during World War II to protect democracy around the world, suddenly in a state where you couldn't vote for president, you couldn't vote for a U.S. senator.
Anchorage became the center of the statehood movement. led by people like Bob Atwood, the publisher of the Anchorage Times.
Atwood's push for statehood even got the attention of the famous CBS newsman, Edward R. Murrow.
And observers like Robert Atwood, editor of the Anchorage Times, blame the big Seattle interests who dominate the Alaskan fisheries.
Well, statehood has had only one opponent who has gone on record opposed to statehood and who is organized and spends money opposing statehood, and that's the Alaska salmon industry, which has headquarters in Seattle.
And on July 7th, 1958, President Eisenhower, long an opponent of Alaskan statehood, signed the 49th state into existence.
Without the impetus that came from Anchorage, Alaska would probably have never become a state.
Whistles went off, sirens went off, bells started to ring, and the population of Anchorage just flowed downtown.
And a young fur Rondi queen made history.
I was working at City Hall at the time, and the gentleman called and said, "Would you like to pin the 49th star on the flag?" And I said, "Oh, what an honor, I'd love to," thinking nothing of how I was going to get to the top floor of the building. So they had a fire truck. And as I recall, one of the firemen pushed me up the ladder.
A few friends knew she had a lifelong fear of high places.
And after I got up there, I thought, oh, what a horrible omen if I dropped the star. So I didn't know whether I was more worried about dropping the star or falling off myself. But we got through it, and it was the thrill of a lifetime. It was a great day. Statehood was a day that was just something that no one will ever forget.
People had been saving wood and all kinds of things for, I don't know how long, but it was just amazing.
Arlis Sturgielewski, who would one day become a state senator, had driven up the Alcan several years earlier.
The excitement of the bonfire was tremendous. It was humongous. Everybody was there. There was just this infectious mood of excitement that we had accomplished this, and here is this bonfire that is beyond belief. I think we're very lucky we didn't burn down the bloody town.
It was just, wow, we did it, and it was great.
The rise of the city would produce many iconic images. To hear from perhaps the greatest expert on Anchorage portraits, we need to jump forward to 2014.
We had some friends over for dinner, and I said to the lady, I said, "Would you mind coming into the studio? I've got this idea. I want to do a portrait every day for this entire year, and you could be my first one." She says, "Yeah, can I bring my daughter?" That was my first portrait.
But at the same time, I don't want you blocking the light that you see this light that's
By the fall of 2014, Anchorage photographer Clark Mishler had taken one portrait every day for nearly 5 years. Whatever the weather, every day.
Haven't missed a day yet.
In the 100 years of the city's history, no one has looked so carefully into the eyes of its people. And he's learned that while there is no one face, they do share something undeniably Anchorage.
We're not all typical Alaskans, where we all ski or we all skate or we all mush, or fish. This is not a place for wishy-washy people. You have to be strong and up for anything and ready for anything.
Good, good, good. Look right here, Philip.
There are hard times here. This is not a good place to be homeless. I think Anchorage is a crazy quilt of people.
We asked him, if his photographs could talk, what would they say?
They'd go, yeah, that's us. We're superheroes, superhuman. Probably like 20 degrees out there. These guys are just fine. I think he's saying we might be cold, but we know how to dress.
I love the fact that Alaskans have more gear than the average person. You know, we've got our summer gear, we've got our fall gear, we've got our winter gear, we've got our spring gear. This picture could have been taken in the 1950s or the 1930s, right?
Or next year.
Or next year. I think she really typifies one of the sectors of Alaskan women, which is can do, don't mess with me, I'm as good as any man. You can take that to the bank.
How long are you going to do this portrait a day?
I'd like to do it for a decade.
Every day?
If I could do a portrait a day for 10 years, every day, I feel that I will have accomplished something that nobody else has done.
What do you think it'll be like the day after you stop?
I think I'll be dead. Yeah.
You drop, you take cover, and you hold on, all right? And that's gonna protect you from falling debris and breaking glass.
This earthquake simulator, operated by the state of Alaska, is designed to educate and prepare Alaskans.
This mimics a shallow fault quake, and it's a great tool for teaching people about earthquake behavior.
It only lasts 30 seconds, the shaking equivalent to an 8.0 earthquake. And yet this is not even close to what happened 5 years after the statehood celebration on Good Friday of 1964.
We were watching the show of all times, which was Fireball XL5.
Okay, Venus.
With only 2 TV stations in Anchorage, many kids were watching the same show.
And that's when the earthquake started. And I remember we all kind of jumped up. The TV fell over, and the house literally rocked like a ship.
In downtown Anchorage, a side of the JCPenney building collapses, killing 2 people. 4th Avenue drops as much as 30 feet.
The house starts to shake and rattle.
Penelope Mossy Mead, just 8 at the time, was one of 5 Mead children living on Chilligan Drive. Her father, a surgeon, is at work. Her mother has gone shopping for Easter presents. Her oldest brother, Perry, is left in charge. All of the kids are watching Fireball XL5. Mossy sent the makers of this documentary a written account of what happened next. Alaskan actress Betsy Scott reads Mossy's words.
The ground is shaking hugely from side to side. I find it hard to keep myself from being thrown off my feet.
It just flung us to the ground.
Like the Mead family, next-door neighbor Tay Thomas rushes outside with her 2 children. No one who survived the quake in Anchorage had a more terrifying experience than what these 2 neighbors were about to endure.
A few seconds later, I turned back and the front doorway had split right down the middle.
Perry erupts from the house and he drops the 2 little ones by the porch and runs.
I saw a big black line go zigzagging across the lawn.
The huge cracks snatched Perry from sight in a split second.
All of a sudden, I could feel that we were moving down.
Little Merrill, 2 years old, is gone. A crevasse opened up and took him.
All around them, the earth is collapsing, destroying 75 homes. Both families slide hundreds of feet down towards the mudflats. Mossy and one brother are left standing on top of what used to be their car. Her other 2 brothers are dead.
What had been our driveway in a quiet, wooded neighborhood was now a high bluff of cascading sand.
All of the noise stopped. It was just utter silence.
The Great Alaskan Earthquake registers 9.2, the second strongest in the Earth's recorded history. But it's the extreme length, over 4.5 minutes of historic violence, that still astounds scientists. Buildings crushed, schools chopped in half, transportation destroyed region-wide. 15 people are killed instantly, and another 124 die in the tsunamis that follow. The rebuilding of Anchorage would change the city forever. But for those who suffered the most, like Mossy Mead, now a grown woman, the ground in many ways is still shaking.
I spent most of my adult life suffering from a chronic heart hunger and loneliness.
We were left without lights, we were left without power. It was a scary time.
What no one in the city could have possibly known was that the earthquake would mark the beginning of the most productive chapter in the city's history. In the first days after the quake, building contractor Walter Hickel, who would twice go on to become governor, announced to many's surprise that he'd decided to build the state's biggest hotel in Anchorage. 1 year later, he built the first of 3 towers.
Wally Hickel spoke for a lot of people who felt that this was a temporary thing on our way to a continued successful future.
And yet back in 1964, something even more important was happening offshore. Oil had already been discovered in nearby Swanson River. The first Cook Inlet oil leases had just been sold. And within 3 years, the largest oil field in U.S. history was discovered at Prudhoe Bay. The oil years would not be without setback. Howard Weaver, a young reporter for the Anchorage Daily News, would share the Pulitzer Prize for exposing the corruption that arrived with the pipeline.
Anchorage's housing market is about as depressed.
The Anchorage economy would collapse in the 80s when oil prices plummeted. And then the worst oil spill in the nation's history happened in nearby Prince William Sound. But for almost 50 years, oil also made the state and the city rich.
Prosperity, once it starts, it kind of bubbles throughout the whole economy.
Deacon Randall with 7 or 8 seconds.
Rising oil revenues affected all aspects of city life, from sporting events to education.
I arrived in Anchorage right in the boom of oil. Alaska was investing a lot in their schools and specifically their teachers.
Astronomer Brian Schmidt says by the 1980s, he had high school teachers with PhDs, thanks largely to rising spending on education.
The teachers I had at Bartlett were of a level of sophistication that people who go to the most expensive prep schools in the world, quite frankly, don't get.
Schmidt went to Harvard and in 2011 won the Nobel Prize for Physics.
And if I had not gotten my education at Bartlett, there was no way I would have been able to go on and become a scientist and have the opportunity to do things like winning a Nobel Prize.
Oil revenues also helped fund the 1,000-mile Iditarod, which begins in Anchorage and is known as the last great race on Earth. In fact, at times, 90% of the state's revenues have come from oil, as well as much of its charitable funding.
Nationally, all corporations give 5%, but in Alaska, the oil industry by itself is 11%. I mean, it's significantly more than any place that I've ever lived.
3, 2, 1, go!
So the people that are here participating, walking or running for the event, are here raising money and awareness for homelessness in Anchorage.
The United Way's Walk for Warmth is just one of many events where individuals and corporate teams come together to help.
The company itself gives a lot to Anchorage, and they encourage their employees to do the same.
Oh, we're doing good.
It's all helping make Anchorage
Walking for our community.
a city that its first philanthropist, remember Zach Lusak, probably would have liked.
It helps families that need help with rental assistance or help paying their heating bills during the wintertime.
We have a very strong United Way, actually, that raises almost more money than any city in America our size, and we have the highest giving to public radio and television in the country.
Okay. Now let's go over the choices. What about proposition number 3?
In the early 80s, Anchorage Mayor George Sullivan was cast as coach to encourage voters to support funding large capital projects with the oil windfall.
We're talking about indoors, outdoors, we're talking about swimming.
Mayor from the 60s to the 80s, Sullivan was the city's longest sitting mayor, unifying the city and borough, creating the modern municipality.
George had an Irish wit, but also steel in his backbone.
Sullivan's Project 80s reshaped the city, building the Center for the Performing Arts, the William Egan Convention Center, the Lusac Library, and the appropriately titled George Sullivan Sports Arena. Another benefit of Project 80s, when you look at Anchorage from above, almost every neighborhood is surrounded, connected by green space.
People really were wanting a different kind of city, a city that had a quality of life.
Tony Knowles succeeded Sullivan as mayor, overseeing a city building new infrastructure, new water supplies, landfills, green belts, and a coastal trail. Which is why this may be a good place to again stop the clock, to remember that what shapes this city, and many who live in it, is often not what, but where. Anchorage sits immediately at the edge of Chugach State Park, which many acknowledge that in any other state would be a national park. From downtown, it's just 25 minutes to many of the park's trailheads. Within 5 minutes, hikers can enter almost 500,000 acres of wilderness, and often not run into another human being. Which means the city down at the park's edge can be wild, even on the evening news.
Now, that family of bears drew a big crowd here at Goose Lake Park over the weekend.
More than 300 bears spend some of their time inside the city limits. And yet the star of Anchorage wildlife?
We must be the biggest city, at least in North America, that has moose. They're just a large deer, but they're a very large deer. They're 1,000 pounds. In the summertime, there are probably 200 or 300 moose in the Anchorage Bowl.
One result, many of Anchorage's human residents, instant moose experts.
They don't eat potatoes, chips, and they don't eat yogurt. They don't eat sandwiches, and they don't eat noodles. That's all I know.
And it's not just the park and urban wildlife that sets the city apart. It's also the light. During the long summer, the northern sun strikes from every angle. It illuminates the city like opening night. And during the long winter nights, we'll let this man pick up that part of the story.
My name is Todd Salat. I'm a full-time aurora hunter.
This Anchorage photographer has logged thousands of miles capturing the northern lights. He says 2015 could be one of the best years ever.
Right now, the sun's going through a huge magnetic reversal, which means more aurora activity, which means more fun chasing the auroras.
His favorite photograph? This one.
That was, well, probably the best shot I've ever taken to date, is the float plane shot with the auroras right here in Anchorage. It was dead calm, crystal clear.
For everyone who's never seen the aurora outside Anchorage on a clear winter night, here you go.
For me, the Northern Lights were one of the things that helped capture my imagination of astronomy. I would go out and film them, and still have some pretty good photos from way back then.
Remember Brian Schmidt? The Nobel laureate says growing up beneath the Anchorage skies helped him in a way few things could have. His Nobel Prize? He proved the universe is in fact expanding, faster than the speed of light. Being well-grounded is one thing, but genius? For one teenager, that required the Anchorage sky.
We can only see 13.8 billion years back in time. But we believe there's stuff beyond what we can see. Does that really exist? What was before the Big Bang?
End mission!
Maybe not the Big Bang, but big enough. Any account of the city at 100 would highlight the 13,000 men and women of Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, the $12 billion, 84,000-acre Air Force Army base adjoining Anchorage.
Imagine being a kid and flying like Superman, but you're doing it backwards.
On this day, Spartan paratroopers with the 4th Infantry Brigade are preparing to jump from a C-17 to what they call the Malamute Drop Zone, down below. Among those falling from the Alaskan sky today, Major Dan Erskine.
All your senses are overloaded. It's almost like time slows down a little bit before that parachute comes out. And all of a sudden it's really quiet. It goes from being kind of noisy to all of a sudden really quiet. And wow, I feel like joining the Army again today. It was just a lot of fun.
Any issues, any questions with the jets?
On Elmendorf Air Force Base, Air Force Captain Jordan Levine is briefing fighter pilots.
On Tango, left-hand turn and a quick right-hand turn.
They're suiting up to pilot F-22 Raptors for war games against the so-called enemy pilots from Eielson Air Force Base in Fairbanks.
It is basically strapping a rocket ship to your back and trying to keep control of it.
Captain Levine says the city's location is at least as strategic as it was back in World War II, which means they must always be ready.
We have a close proximity to a lot of the hot spots in the rest of the world. So something that Raptors can now provide is basically air superiority throughout the entire world at a moment's notice.
And that same focus on strategic location is the reason for the Anchorage FedEx Processing Center, and why a city seemingly so far from anywhere is close to almost everywhere.
The enormity of what we do, it's overwhelming. We handle close to 8,000 international flights a year, both coming from Asia and coming from the lower 48, connecting each other.
As managing director of the company's Alaska operations, Dale Shaw knows the city sits within a 9.5-hour flight of 90% of the entire northern hemisphere.
We serve flights going to Narita, Incheon, Shanghai, Beijing.
Put it this way, if you live anywhere in Europe or the United States and you have an iPhone,
the electronics that folks use on a daily basis, there's a really good chance that that actually moved through Anchorage at some point in time.
The railroad may have launched the city of Anchorage, but it was the airplane that literally solidified its dominance as the economic and political center of Alaska.
But if you want to go to one place to experience the heart of Alaska aviation, its roots, its story, think small.
Checking in.
Rust's flying service is just one of many air taxis.
Watch your head there, actually.
Lake Hood is the busiest float plane base in the world. Add nearby Merrillfield, and Anchorage becomes the small plane capital of the world. At one count, Merrillfield alone had 40,000 more flights a year than Newark International. Why all the flights?
And it's a great job when the weather's good.
Pilot Bob Glenn says it's because Anchorage has the most spectacular out-of-town of any town.
When you take off from Lake Hood and you leave this seaplane base behind, you leave behind all the noise and the hustle and bustle of the city, and in just a few minutes you're in wilderness. In the wilderness you'll see glaciers, mountains, wildlife, just spectacular scenery. And on a scale that you really can't see anywhere else. The best way to see Alaska is by air, because so much of the state is off the road system and isn't accessible in any other way. Or you can fly to Denali National Park, Mount McKinley. You almost don't have a reference to realize how big things are, because there's no houses, there's no people or trees even on the high mountains and the glaciers, and it's just immense.
Right now we're at the Eklutna Cemetery. When most people think about Eklutna, this is usually the first thing that comes to their mind. And these are spirit houses.
Within the city limits, there's a place unlike any other. Part Russian, part Athabascan, a resting place for the original people.
They're believed to house the spirit of the person who's recently left this world.
Before anyone even dreamed of a railroad or a city, Aaron Leggett's ancestors were here. The Dena'ina gathered berries, fished, and hunted Upper Cook Inlet, and specifically where the city of Anchorage now sits.
Right now, we're at Nuchishtunt, Point Warnzoff. The Dena'ina name actually means place protected from the wind. And for well over 1,000 years, my ancestors and relatives would come and they would have seasonal summer fish camps.
While the mudflats of Ship Creek would one day give birth to the city, the original people needed it too. If the winter had been harsh and their people were starving, this is where they would come.
The Dena'ina name for Ship Creek is Dagaitnu, or Stickleback Creek. During times of famine or shortage, the Dena'ina knew to come here during the late spring, and they could dip in the creek for the three-spined stickleback, and they knew that this was something that could get them through until the king salmon returned.
The beginning of Anchorage would also mark an end. The Dena'ina's fishing camps were overtaken. They were barred from their traditional hunting and gathering grounds.
We were basically told we couldn't live where we had lived for thousands of years during the summer, and that we were no longer able to have access to this specific creek.
But the story of the Dena'ina people does not end with tragedy and loss. Every 2 years, they welcome a growing number of tribes from across Alaska and the rest of the nation to the Eklutna Powwow.
It's just a chance for us Dena'ina to thank the Creator for all that we have. For me, it's just a chance for us to say we're still here.
And following the passage of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act in 1971, Alaskan natives formed Native Regional Corporations. Here, the descendants of Anchorage's original people are building the new offices for Cook Inlet Region Incorporated, or CIRI. Sophie Minnick is the president and CEO of CIRI, and one of the more than 23,000 Alaskan natives and American Indians who now call Anchorage home, making it the largest native village in Alaska. Every culture, Aleut, Inuit, Inupiat, Yupik, Chupik, Athabascan, Tlingit, Haida, Tsimshian, and most have their regional corporate headquarters in Anchorage.
Who would have guessed that that would have happened 40 years ago? But today, when you look out at the landscape of Anchorage and you see, Arctic Slope Regional Corporation on a building, you see Siri, you see Chugach, you see Doyon, you see Nana, you see Chalista. It's amazing.
In fact, Alaska's regional native corporations had over $11 billion in revenue in 2010 and are invested not only in Alaska, but internationally.
Having Anchorage become headquarters of a number of the Alaska Native corporations adds another whole dimension to the Alaskan economy. It means that we're the headquarters of some major international corporations.
So it seems only fitting that Ship Creek, that once sustained the Dena'ina people with stickleback, would now give birth to this. The Port of Anchorage, where the giant towers, generators, and equipment were loaded en route to one of the Dena'ina's original fishing grounds, just off the city's coast, Fire Island.
The Athabascan people used to harvest their fish on Fire Island on the beaches and the shores of the island. Today, we're harvesting the wind on the island.
The island that sustained the Dena'ina will now provide clean, sustainable power to Anchorage for as long as the wind blows.
To think back 100 years ago when those first settlers arrived at Ship Creek and to where we are today, they saw a glimpse of our Alaska Native culture. But 100 years later, you see it everywhere you turn in Anchorage, Alaska.
Not only is Anchorage Alaska's largest native village, it includes the most diverse neighborhoods in the entire nation. Just look into the faces of East High School's graduating class of 2014.
When you're seeing the graduates of East High School, you are seeing the most diverse student body. They are graduating from the most diverse high school in the entire United States.
Chad Farrell at the University of Alaska Anchorage is a demographer. He studies populations. You could argue his own backyard includes perhaps the most interesting population in America. He says not only is East the country's most diverse high school, Anchorage's Bartlett and West are second and third.
This is not solely an issue of East High School and Bartlett and West. All of our high schools in Anchorage are above the national average in diversity.
We're going to look on the maps and see if we can find some names of some streets downtown.
In Mrs. Smith's second grade class at Mountain View Elementary, her students are learning the city's history.
Okay, let's see what we have here. The Log Cabin Visitor Center. Anybody ever seen that downtown? It's got that grass growing on top.
Yet in some ways, it's the class itself that's making history.
When you're talking to your family, if you speak a different language that is not English.
There are now more than 100 languages spoken in the Anchorage School District.
Here yet.
Miss Smith, I found Goose Lake.
You found Goose
But this
Lake?
school serves Mountain View, the most diverse neighborhood in the entire nation.
I pledge allegiance to the flag.
If you look at the top 10 neighborhoods in the United States in terms of diversity, Mountain View's there at the top, and there are a couple others here in Anchorage. Then there's basically one neighborhood in Seattle, and the rest are in Queens, New York City.
Which is why Multicultural Night at Mountain View Elementary, the annual celebration of diversity, is literally world class.
Our family's from Somalia. My family's from Thailand. My family, sorry.
Male, our family is from South Sudan.
Inupiaq and from Wales, Alaska. From American Samoa. From Dominica Republica. My family is from Samoa. My mom, My family
Look right.
This is it? Yep. My family is from Inupiaq from King Island.
So when you see something like the annual Polynesian Flag Day, think of the city's Pacific Islanders, of course, but also all the immigrants who have created the city. African, Chinese, Czech, Danish, Dutch, English, Canadian, German, Irish, Italian, Japanese, Korean, Laotian, Mexican, Polish, Russian, Scandinavian, Scottish, Welsh, and many, many more. Because Anchorage has always been a city for immigrants who come to labor, often working jobs that few want, believing, like the early settlers, that something good might happen for themselves and their families.
I came to Anchorage in April of 1991 as a foreign exchange student.
At Anchorage's Romic Middle School, Ana Eli Leon Hernandez teaches English-speaking students in Spanish. But this isn't a Spanish class, it's social studies taught in Spanish for students who want to be truly bilingual, comfortable speaking two languages.
¿Quién es tu grupo? Show. Oh. Show.
But perhaps the most powerful lesson for her social studies students is the teacher herself. An immigrant from Venezuela, she learned Anchorage needed bilingual teachers, and she saw opportunity.
Anchorage is just amazing. Anchorage is welcoming. Anchorage has given me my education. Anchorage has given me over 1,000 students that I look up to with honor and pride.
So she worked hard, and like many before her, started her own family in Anchorage. And then when it came time for her to become a full naturalized U.S. citizen, her students were there to see for themselves how Americans are made.
The Constitution and the laws
of the United States of America.
Of the United States of America.
Congratulations, United States.
That one flag, I will forever keep that flag. That one was the one that allowed me feel that honor, that privilege that I don't think I have felt ever, even though I've been teaching U.S. history for so long. It's Anchorage. It's Anchorage. I mean, I've lived in Anchorage for 22 years. This is where my children live, and this is where my students are. This is home.
All aboard! And finally, no picture of Anchorage at 100 would be complete without the modern Alaska Railroad. It could never quite live up to the grandiose vision of 1915.
Warren Harding had thought that the railroad would be like a magic wand that would unlock Alaska's resources. The gold mines, the coal mines, and the large agricultural settlements. Unfortunately, in this case, the magic wand didn't work.
The state of Alaska bought it from the federal government and now controls its future. While the Alaska Railroad may never again dominate the city which set it in motion, it remains the journey of a lifetime. The railroad is also a reminder that the people who built it, along with Alaska's greatest city, didn't stop. So we end the city's story back at its beginning. Those first moving images and the question, who were they? Much of what was true back then still is. And as for who were they, you could argue they're still here.
Anchorage is still the great Alaskan experiment, where people come and try to become something they're not even sure what they're going to become yet. Anchorage is still a work in progress.
Thank you so much for watching the end.
Wait, thank you so much for watching.
Thank you for watching the end. Thank you so much 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 for watching the
Thank you for watching.
This is the end.
Thank you for watching, and this is the end.